Hi students. Today we are looking at Is Everyone Really Equal? Specifically, Chapter 7, Understanding the Invisibility of Oppression Through Sexism. I like the quote that this chapter starts off with because I think it is one that we hear a lot because this term feminist has a bad taste for some individuals. So the quote at the beginning says, "I believe women are equal, but I am not a feminist." So it's kind of a contradictory message that quote implies, because feminism is all about equity and equality amongst all genders and sexes. So if you believe women are equal, but you don't consider yourself a feminist, you are contradicting that women aren't actually equal, because you're countering a whole group of people that work for equality of the sexes. It starts with this interesting story about a person running for office and their platform, and it's very anti-women, basically. And a lot of women end up supporting this candidate in this fictional story, and then they win, and then they strike down a lot of mentioning of equity issues for women and LGBTQ rights. So it's framing the chapter for us. Some of the terms here in this chapter include feminism, post-feminism, commodification, internalized oppression, misogyny, androcentrism, and patriarchy. And the chapter is reminding us about the iceberg imagery that was in an earlier chapter, I believe chapter 3, Culture and Socialization, on page 37. And it says that our socialization shapes our below-the-surface ideas about groups of people. And these ideas are a result of myriad institutional forces. So it starts off with this term that you might have heard thrown around a lot in academic circles, especially: institution, institutional power, institutional corruption. What is all of that referring to? Well, on page 103, the authors define institution: a large-scale, established set of laws, customs, practices, and organizations that govern the political or social life of a people. Institutions make and enforce a society's rules and norms. Examples of institutions include marriage and family, religion, schooling, military, prisons, government, law, mass media, and corporations. And there are many more institutions not listed in the book. That is on page 103. And so they ask you to understand how these institutions of power produce, circulate, and maintain a dominant culture's norms, values, definitions, language, policies, and ideologies. At the bottom of 103, it explains the overarching ideology that has shaped all institutions is patriarchy. And then in the little gray text box, you'll see right here, there is a very specific definition: the belief in the inherent superiority of men and male norms, and the organization of society based on this belief. The authors say that it's important to think of patriarchy as a macro-level belief system from which sexism, which is the oppression of women, flows from. So you have to understand that patriarchy is not reduced to a one-on-one interaction between two individuals. It's something that affects all areas of life. So, for instance, the reason why there are much fewer women professors at colleges and universities versus women teachers at, say, a K through 12 level of education is all stemmed around this idea of patriarchy and what roles were determined for women as being home educators before even entering into a working world and being, quote, allowed to by a socialized norm of what was okay women behavior, because women have often been policed and controlled by society's norms. The chapter continues with examples of sexism today. On page 104, the authors explain, it is easy for most people to accept that denying women the right to vote, enslaving blacks, or forcing indigenous children to attend residential schools are all examples of oppression. Because our attention is directed to isolated events from the past rather than the overall picture, current patterns of oppression become harder for us to see. So the authors are trying to get you as a reader and as a critical thinker to understand, as apparent with the title of the chapter, the invisibility of oppression through sexism. So it's very easy for people to claim, oh, well, that was all in the past. We don't have those issues anymore. Women are equal. They get to work whatever jobs they want. They can enter institutions of power like government and have key roles to make change, right? But they want you to track oppression today via this notion of sexism, and they provide some very important statistics to demonstrate that the overall outcomes haven't changed, and we still have a terrible issue with the oppression of women and sexism. And so they give you some global context about 6 key facts, and they also provide citation information. So you as a critical thinker and reader can go and find this data on your own. For instance, in 2012, 1 in 2 women killed worldwide was killed by their partner or family. And then they give you the citation, United Nations 2017. So they want you to see the larger patterns, the macro structures of sexism. Then on page 105, the authors give you some important information for how sexism affects us here in the United States and in Canada. For instance, the very first bullet point there, 1 in 4 women in the United States has experienced domestic violence, and 1 in 3 women has been a victim of rape. And that statistic is from 2017. So I think it's really important to see that this violence and inequities are still being perpetuated against women, and that they are primarily perpetrated by men. The authors also answer the question, what makes this sexism so difficult to see? And so on pages 106 through 107, they explain how our dominant culture is one that focuses on individuals, which obscures group level patterns. So if we view oppression as isolated events, or as an extreme example of violence against a single woman, the broader patterns are more obscured. And that is discussed on page 106 in the second paragraph. So that's the micro versus macro levels of justice and equity issues. It's much easier to explain that was a one-time isolated incident with so-and-so, and it doesn't represent larger society. It also sometimes feels like that is easier to fix or solve if it's on an individual basis, rather than changing the structures of the institutions that constantly deny the equality of women or individuals who self-identify as women. So they talk about that dominant culture focus and the lack of the group level patterns. Second, they talk about corporate produced popular culture and how that changes how we view gender and issues about women versus men. And they talk, for instance, about toys and how toys amplify rigid gender roles. That girls are very early socialized into notions of femininity that include nurturing, caring, beauty play, maybe dress up. And then boys are often socialized into masculinity plays, which are often defined as aggressive, violent, physical play. And as a larger society, a lot of people don't question these gender norms that are being reinforced by toys. And corporate culture profits off of our inability to say, wait a minute, something's wrong here, when you have a young girl playing mom with babies or with dolls, and a young boy is not allowed to do the same thing because it's not seen as appropriate for his gender. So the authors ask you to consider that, and consider expanding and stretching your definitions of what that means to be masculine or feminine. And then they also talk a lot about how the advertising that goes into corporate culture also pushes the idea of individualism and free choice. So that's at the bottom of 106 and goes on to page 107. Finally, a third aspect that the authors talk about is that sexism is often obscured through this ideology of civilized versus non-civilized. We've talked about binaries before in the class, either through assignments or through these lecture videos. And the example they give here in this chapter is the East versus the West. So the West is considered a civilized and liberated place where women can do anything and be anything, and the East, most often exampled through, quote, a Muslim woman, is seen as the archetypal oppressed woman who's very much in stark contrast to our liberation that we have here in the West. And the authors explain why looking at gender and looking at the oppression of women through sexism in this binary lens is very harmful. And they give you some binaries. They have a list here on page 107. And they say one of the big things is that our attention is continually drawn to examples of sexism that have occurred over there at someplace else in a non-white, non-Western context. And so it's almost situated in kind of a past context, and that result as an issue that doesn't affect us, that we don't need to work on here in our society, which is not the case. The chapter continues with the discourses of sexism in advertising, and they actually talk a lot about sports in this section, and the notion that girls in sports are often not taken as seriously as their male counterparts, that there's an emphasis that if they are overly aggressive in their sports, that there's a lack of femininity. There's a mention of, a laundry detergent ad from 2006 in a Tide campaign. This section is, and there's a lot of names and a lot of examples mentioned, both from the US and from Canada. And this section was particularly interesting for me because I was an individual who used to play sports back in the day. And it was funny because I was just having this conversation with my significant other about a show we were watching in which the bleachers were packed for the boys basketball team. And I was laughing because I remember in high school, we on the women's basketball team always struggled to have attendance outside of our own families or friends that were coming. And I was asking the question, why is that? And so some of that understanding about sexism that comes into play in sports is discussed here in this chapter about that. And there's also on page 110, well, at the bottom of 109 through 110, they give some facts about how much time children interact with media. And it's going to be very interesting to see how these numbers have changed in recent years, especially regarding everything that's been going on now. But it says in 2010, a study by the Kaiser Family Institute reported that youth between the ages of 8 to 18 spent 7.5 hours per day, 7 days a week with media, and that youth aged 8 to 12 could spend 6 hours a day, while teens would be spending 9 hours and more watching things, streaming videos online. And the authors discuss why this is very significant, because if you remember in our Socialization chapter from chapter 3, we are socialized as children and as young people. And so you have the most vulnerable demographic being exposed to these advertisements that we as adults might say, oh yeah, they don't affect me at all. But the reality is that these advertisements are actually norming our children, or are actually still affecting us, and we do not see that effect. It's almost unconscious. And so they give you a little bit of information about that on page 110, and they stress very significantly that virtually everything in advertising is gendered, furthering the strict division between men and women, their roles in society, and shaping what seems to be neutral or personal consumer choices. And, you know, oftentimes I like to do an activity in my classes about advertising, and students go out and find examples of commercials or print ads that they've seen run. And a famous one that everyone always wants to share are the Carl's Jr. if it doesn't get all over the place, it doesn't belong in your face advertisements, which are extremely gendered and very sexist towards women. So you can always look those up. There's a section on 111 that discusses sexism in movies and slasher films, which is very interesting topic because we're so close to Halloween or El Dia de los Muertos, and so you might be seeing certain things showing up on your streaming devices for horror films. And I was just looking at the Scream franchise, and they have a very gendered explanation of virgins and who's allowed to have sex or not have sex and who might be killed because of it. And, you know, this chapter is just really, really good at going through lots of aspects of culture and multimedia, and giving you examples of how sexism is an issue, it's prevalent. Here are examples, here are studies being done about it, and most of them are very, very contemporary studies within the past decade. So after some discussion of films, and you might look up some of these if you haven't seen them, maybe find a trailer just so you can get a frame of reference. Then they go on to discussing sexism in music videos and some of your favorite artists. They discuss songs and what these means. They go a little bit into pornography in on page 113 and 114, and the representation again of men as dominant, aggressive, and in control of women's bodies, whereas women can often be portrayed as submissive, pleasing, and available for every aspect of men's desires. And they also talk about the virgin whore dichotomy that again affects mainly women. It's like you have to behave a certain way or else your body is policed, your intentions are policed, you're to blame. The old rhetoric of blaming the victim. Oftentimes, even when you are hearing, and this occurred in a class before, there was a suspicious male individual that was bothering students in my class during break time, and the rhetoric that was supplied by the men in the class was, oh, well, women just need to be careful, more careful. They should be going out in groups. They shouldn't leave late at night. And so it's this gendered rhetoric that women are doing something wrong, rather than putting the blame where the blame is due on a man that is using some kind of power to try to get women to submit to this fear, like something's wrong with a woman. So that was an interesting discussion we had in our class when that happened, and we ended up calling campus police about the individual who was hanging around the classroom. So those kind of notions are discussed on page 114 specifically. And then on 115, they stress again that, on a deeper level, we are influenced by images, and no one is outside of socialization. So they want to remind you to make connections back to that earlier chapter. And, that's basically it. They talk a little bit on the last page about the Equal Rights Amendment, and they say the ERA has not passed, and they give more statistics in terms of where males dominate in different institutions. So they talk about government and businesses on page 116. So when you say, oh, but now we have female senators, well, when you look at the overall breakdown of how many female senators we have compared to male senators, you will see the disparities. And finally, the definition of feminism, which I talked a little bit about at the beginning of this video, is described on page 117. I'm not sure why they waited till the end of the chapter, but it's the belief that women are equal to men, the advocacy for the social, economic, and political equality of all sexes. So if you have any questions about that chapter, reach out to me via email as always.